The subject of climate change has been discussed throughout the years and decades, so much so that you would think strides have been made. However, that is not the case. Major corporations and rich countries have fallen short in their so-called promises. Hi, I'm Kavita Vai. In this edition of the program, we will take a look at COP26 summit in Glasgow. What happened there? Climate pledges made, did it fall short? Also, we're going to take a look at the following. The COP26 summit was something that was hailed, but the commitments by 25 nations to end finance for overseas oil and gas, well, it fell short. The catch would not take effect until the year 2022. Then hypocrisy in action. COP26 deal lacks large coal-using countries. Study shows CO2 almost back at pre-COVID-19 level. The guilty countries that did not pledge: Australia, China, and the United States. Also, take a look at the climate protests, one of the highlights of the COP26 summit. Coal pledge, a complete joke, is what the climate activists said, worried they were, and rightly so, the disconnect between slow pace of emissions reductions and climate emergency.
Nothing will be saved without you. It is important to begin with the fact you were born to be creators of the ground entrusted.
The 26th session of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
The opening of the COP26 summit in Glasgow. But it all came down to the final draft communique.
So, we got a very lengthy draft decisions from the presidency.
We need much more concrete action to be sure that we actually really meet this 1.5 target.
But the details of the draft showed the inconsistency with the intention of phasing out coal.
There is a reference of phasing out coal. And we are stronger believers that phase out of coal deserves also a deadline.
Let's take a look at some social media posts on this issue. We go straight to the U.S. with this tweet. It's from Climate Reality, which is founded by the former U.S. Vice President Al Gore. More than 250,000 Americans are exposed to levels of cancer risk above the highest limit set by the EPA. It's an environmental justice nightmare, and the culprits won't surprise you. Toxic pollution from fossil fuels and petrochemical facilities. Now, we're going to stay in the U.S. and look at U.S. Senator Ted Cruz and what he said about the climate change summit that took place in Glasgow. This tweet from the Post Millennial cites how he has called out on the Democrats for the climate hypocrisy.
Not only do they not believe what they're saying, but their hypocrisy is rampant. Headed to this climate conference, these officials flew in giant jets. John Kerry has a private jet that has flown dozens of times this past year all around the country. I don't know about you, but I don't have a private jet. I don't believe any of the people on this stage have their own private jet.
Portman does. Yeah. Small one.
John Kerry, when asked about his private jet, said, really, for someone like me, it's the only way that makes sense to travel. What dripping, condescending arrogance.
Joining us here in this segment is Robert Evans. He's a former member of the European Parliament. He is a British Labour cooperative politician who served as a member of the European Parliament from 1994 until 2009. He was first elected to the European Parliament for London North West, and then in 1999 and 2004 for the London constituency. Okay, Robert, welcome. Taking a look at what the U.S. Senator Ted Cruz has said about U.S. hypocrisy, slamming his fellow senator like John Kerry and other world leaders as a whole on traveling on jets to this COP26 Glasgow summit. Does he have a point there?
Yeah, I think it's sending entirely the wrong message. I realize the challenges that some global leaders have getting from A to B or getting from their own country to Glasgow. But I think it's sending entirely the wrong message when they arrive in private airplanes and use private jets to go around. Most of these airlines have flights that could have come to London where they could have got a train, or a number of people could have managed it. Using private airplanes, which are private jets, very, very carbon expensive, is entirely, not so much unnecessary, but it's sending completely the wrong message to everybody else. We had the situation where our Prime Minister Boris Johnson came back to London by private jet. Well, I looked it up. There were 6 possible scheduled airline flights that he could have taken, or a train from Glasgow to London. And we cannot have one rule for them and one rule for everybody else. So I think global leaders needed to reflect on that. Whatever the challenge is, there's plenty of airlines that could have accommodated them.
Well, what Robert says there makes sense. It sounds fair enough. But herein actually lies the hypocrisy of what the U.S. Senator Ted Cruz has said. He received actually more money from oil and gas companies in 2018 than any other senator. Ted Cruz received nearly $800,000 from the oil and gas industry in the year 2018. And actually, when it comes to U.S. senators, 4 U.S. senators, 1 in 4 that is U.S. senators, still hold fossil fuel investments. The households of at least 28 senators own a combined minimum of $3.7 million and as much as $12.6 million in fossil fuel assets. Now, let's take a look at this tweet. It says the vicious spiral of global debt leaves countries at the front line of the climate crisis, unable to respond to its fallout. And the failure of the world's richest countries to lift the burden exposes their climate hypocrisy, as stated by the Tribune. When it comes to the COP26, it has actually exposed rich countries' debt hypocrisy. And that is where the problem is. Last year, $372 billion flowed out of lower income countries in debt repayments. These are vital resources that could have been directed to tackling the climate emergency and the pandemic. Instead, lower income countries are now paying 5 times more in debt that they are spending on fighting the climate crisis. Luca Iacoboni is a campaign manager for energy and climate, Greenpeace Italy, who joins us here to give his take on this. Luca, thanks for joining us here. When you take a look at the developing countries, there was a lack of representation. Why was that at this COP26 summit?
Most affected countries, so the countries that actually see climate change impacting their daily life almost every day around the world, are those countries that are less represented in the COP, also in Glasgow. And this is absolutely unacceptable, because the richest countries are those who are less feeling the impacts of climate change and should hear the voices of the most affected countries and of the most affected people. This is another important sign of the fact that at the moment, also the COP26 in Glasgow is doing a lot of words, but really not enough actions.
All right, thank you very much for that. Luca telling us his reason for why they were underrepresented at the COP26. Now, do you know how much money was spent actually to fight the COVID-19 pandemic? How much money was spent saving businesses and governments and countries from actually crashing? Well, the Prime Minister of Barbados at the COP26 summit shed light on that and how there could have been a solution already in reducing global warming to the desired 1.5 degrees Celsius goal.
The central banks of the wealthiest countries engaged in $25 trillion of quantitative easing in the last 13 years. 25 trillion. Of that, 9 trillion was in the last 18 months to fight the pandemic. Had we used that 25 trillion to purchase bonds, to finance the energy transition, or the transition of how we eat, or how we move ourselves in transport, we would now today be reaching that 1.5 degrees limit that is so vital to us.
Our final social media post is about a social media giant that has changed its name to Meta, namely Facebook. A campaign advisor placed a large melting iceberg sculpture next to the Capitol building in Washington. This group said that Facebook had played a major role in not stopping the spread of climate disinformation.
Actually, climate disinformation is rampant on Facebook. There's 1.3 million views of climate disinformation daily. Facebook says that they send 100,000 people to their climate information center every day. But if we look at their numbers versus the numbers that we're getting from the researchers, there's a massive discrepancy of how much climate disinformation there really is on their platform.
Well, do you have an opinion on climate change? You must have one. Please share it with us. Drop us a line. And, well, I don't need to tell you, we look forward to all of your questions or comments, especially on this topic, and especially if you let us know how we're doing. The links and addresses are on your screen now. Time now for our in-depth section. When it comes to climate change, there needs to be strong will on all fronts, from political incentives to budgetary allocations. But with so much ground to cover on the issue, where is there a good place to actually start? Well, let's take a look at the companies that are responsible for most of the greenhouse gas emissions. You agree? That's a good place to start, I think. Taking a look at this, 20 fossil fuel companies, the major ones, they're responsible for 35%. That's a third of the greenhouse gas emissions. Okay, so we know that 20 companies are involved. So let's tackle them. I mean, if we know who these 20 companies are, then we should stop them from doing what they're doing. Well, if it was only that simple. What is needed is strong political will, then action to rein in the oil, gas, and coal companies responsible for them. Okay, let's find out who these companies are. Looking at the companies, well, there's a few of them, but let's look at the top ones. For example, Saudi Aramco, Gazprom, ExxonMobil, BP, Royal Dutch Shell, and then you have some of the other ones that are in the top. Look at how much CO2 they have actually emitted into the climate and into the atmosphere. You're looking at 480 billion tons of carbon dioxide. That's a lot of CO2. Never mind the environmental disasters that have happened over the decades. Okay, this is now where the controversy lies. The whole notion of the use of coal, oil, and gas and its detrimental effects on the climate and the environment, it was known a long time ago, as far back as the year 1965. Okay, let's go back to the year 1965. The U.S. President's Scientific Advisory Committee, it warned pollutants have altered on a global scale the carbon dioxide content of the air and the lead concentrations in ocean waters and human populations. In simpler language, fossil fuels were causing more carbon dioxide, which was altering the air on a global scale with huge risks for mankind. All right, let's move on to example number 2. The head of the American Petroleum Institute issued a warning. The substance of the report was that there is still time to save the world's peoples from the catastrophic consequences of pollution, but that time was running out. So you're having warning after warning. Now, as if that wasn't enough, we're going to go now to the year 1981. This is an internal memo from ExxonMobil revealing a shocking warning. One of its managers sent an internal memo saying that the company's long-term business plans produce effects which will indeed be catastrophic, at least for a substantial fraction of the Earth's population. Well, the big oil companies, however, were not going to pass on their profits. Taking a look at the year 1989, you're looking at a company by the name of Global Climate Coalition. It's a coalition, actually, that was formed. Not an environmental group like the name may suggest. It worked actually to sow doubt about climate change. How did it do it? It lobbied lawmakers to block clean energy legislation and climate treaties throughout the 1990s. So imagine that, to sow doubt, and that's where people doubted the effects of climate change. All right, let's get an analysis on this. Rejoining us here in this segment is Robert Evans. Robert, welcome back. The COP26 goals was to reduce net zero carbon emissions. Okay, and Paris Agreement actually did that along with other summits. However, when you take a look at the commitments, I can mention what India has said, net zero emissions by the year 2070. Or how about Saudi Arabia making a commitment for net zero emissions by the year 2060? However, with no exit plan. I mean, that sounds so far into the future. And we were under the impression that there's not that much time. Don't you think those commitments are a little bit too far?
Yeah, Saudi Arabia is a very rich country that's done very, very well out of oil over many years. And of course, I understand why it's worried about changing it. But if you're going to have a net zero by 2060, that's nearly 40 years away. It's totally unacceptable as a target. Now, it may be that they don't reach it till then, but I do believe that countries have got to set ambitious targets and really make much greater moves. The reason that we are still driving around in petrol-driven cars to the large extent, when 50 years ago they had the technology to build battery vehicles, but they just haven't developed it, is because of the power of the oil industries over the years. The oil industry in the Middle East and the plentiful supply of cheap oil, and America, if the amount of investment had gone into alternative forms that went into, for instance, mobile phones, which are now very sophisticated pieces of technology, if the same amount of effort and energy had gone into a more environmentally friendly mass-produced vehicles, we wouldn't all be driving around in petrol-driven vehicles at the moment.
So what are these subsidies? Who gives them out? First, here's John Kerry, the U.S. climate envoy, raising his concerns on climate change.
The statement lays out important steps on CO2 emissions as well, including the need to accelerate using best efforts by all of us to phase down unabated coal in this decade as fast as is achievable.
If he is the U.S. climate representative, he neglects to point out the following fact: that the U.S. government actually subsidized coal, oil, and gas for decades.
So in the draft today, we saw that coal was referenced in the draft, as well as subsidies. That's not good enough. 86% of the emissions trapped in our atmosphere come from oil, gas, and coal. And while we talk about targets and emissions here, these governments, many of them, especially the wealthy nations, are proposing new projects that would take us past 1.5 degrees.
And that is the hypocrisy of it all, which is no surprise that there are protests against this, as seen here.
At the moment, it's insufficient, and we need, world leaders from the richest and most polluting countries to raise their ambition and to provide a, clear mandate for countries to come back to the table next year with more ambitious emission reduction by 2030.
3, 2, 1, go.
One of the things that stood out in this COP26 summit was the presence and action of the activists urging world leaders to act on climate change. They were keen on pointing out the hypocrisy of feeding lies to the general public. Take this group of activists led by members of the Extinction Rebellion Direct Action Group. They highlighted how the mode of transportation chosen makes a difference, like opting to travel by train rather than air transportation.
Everything, and it is our job to make it very clear. Traveling by train on this distance is just an opportunity to divide by 10 the carbon emission when we compare that to an airline.
Another transportation mode that needs reforming is global shipping. There is actually $1 trillion push to decarbonize it. Freight ships are huge carbon emitters. Therefore, if countries and companies hope to meet Paris Agreement targets, they must change the way freight shipping is managed. The use of electric batteries or alternative fuels is one way to go about this. At present, shipping products across the ocean using freight ships creates more greenhouse gas emissions than the estimated 2 billion US cars and trucks on America's roads, at around 1 billion metric tons. Activists with the group Ocean Rebellion held a theatrical demonstration in COP26 to say that countries need to step up efforts to protect their national waters. They called for greater investment in ocean-based renewable energy decarbonization of industries, and further research.
So today we have one of our Ocean Rebellion classic theatrical performances, creating conscious pricking imagery to try and help tell the story, which today is on the eve of COP Ocean Day, to draw attention to the delegates that our oceans need to be way up on their agenda. Like, it covers 70% of our ocean and provides 50 to 80% of the oxygen that we breathe. So it's vitally important, and our oceans are at crisis point.
It's time now to watch a performance of the classic Italian pop song that happened at the COP26.
Ascoltami.
12 years ago, at the United Nations Climate Summit in Copenhagen, rich nations made a significant pledge. They promised to channel $100 billion a year to less wealthy nations by 2020 to help them adapt to climate change and mitigate further rises in temperature. And in another clear case of climate hypocrisy, a climate activist walked toward the British finance minister and asked him about tax breaks and funding for fossil fuel companies.
Tax breaks to fossil fuel companies. Can you let me know why you're giving tax breaks to fossil fuel companies? Can you let me know when you're giving tax breaks?
There's not much in that suitcase, is there?
The UK Prime Minister made a pledge with some young pupils at his school to cut greenhouse gas emissions. Here he is with his grand announcement.
I think what is it? I promise to get all world leaders to cut CO2 emissions.
And here is the first United States Special Presidential Envoy for Climate, John Kerry, with his grand ambitions.
The IPCC report and the synthesis report of the NDCs indicate that we have to achieve somewhere in the vicinity of a 45% reduction over the next 10 years.
But the best these two leaders could do was to squeeze this out of Saudi Arabia, a 2060 pledge.
على استهداف المملكة العربية السعودية للوصول للحياد الصفري في عام 2060 من خلال نهج الاقتصاد الدائري الكربون بما يتوافق مع خطط المملكة التنموية وتمكين تنويعها الاقتصادي وبما يتماشى مع خط الأساس المتحرك ويحفظ دور المملكة الريادي في تعزيز أمن واستقرار أسواق الطاقة العالمية.
That does it for me. Your questions and comments are truly appreciated if you get the tide. Just drop us a line. Links and addresses are on your screen now.
The COP26 Climate Summit has ended. More than 190 nations reached a deal, but without an enforcement mechanism. Well, critics are saying the agreement, which calls on governments to strengthen greenhouse gas emission cuts, is going to fall short. So there you go. Another summit which fell short. Well, we've told you about climate pledge hypocrisies, but honestly, here's where the problem lies. We are a consumer-driven society. We use billions of products which have the material produced from these oil companies. Unless we change the way we live and spend our money, things are not going to change. These companies know that, and that is why they will not live up to their commitments to clean energy to the fullest. I mean, really, is that even possible? Something to think about. That does for this edition of the program. It was great having you on board. We do appreciate any questions or comments that you can send to us. We always look forward to them. From Miko Vatav and the entire team, it's goodbye until next time.